In the spring of 1883, Kellen Ror rode into Coldwater Basin to take possession of 50 acres he had just bought for an unusually low price, land nobody else wanted. The place was called Raven Bend. Its barn leaned. Sagebrush swallowed the old fence lines. A broken windmill stood over the yard, motionless against the Wyoming sky. The stock trough was dry. Men at Amos Bryce's general store laughed when they heard someone had actually paid for it. Bram Alder, the cattleman on the adjoining ranch, did not find it quite as funny. He had run cattle beside Raven Bend for years. He knew what summer did to weak ground. That place will be dry before August. Kellen heard him. He offered no argument. That evening, he walked the property alone while the last light stretched across the lower meadow. At the empty trough, he knelt and pressed 2 fingers into the cracked mud. Dry on top, cool underneath. Kellen looked toward the distant cottonwoods, then toward a shallow fold in the meadow. The town had already decided what Raven Bend was worth. Kellen had not. At 38, Kellen had never called himself a farmer. What he knew had been learned elsewhere. During the Civil War, serving as a Union cavalryman taught him to put the care of his horses before his own. Afterward, years as a teamster taught him to haul freight, mend wagon gear, raise rough corrals, repair simple pump linkages, and sleep beneath an open sky when no shelter waited ahead. More important, he learned to read country. On long freight runs, water determined the route long before courage did. That was why Raven Bend interested him. The farm lay below a western ridge, a shallow draw across the lower meadow, almost hidden beneath brush. Near it stood several old cottonwoods, thick-trunked and stubbornly alive where the surrounding ground looked too dry to support them. Kellen did not know what lay beneath that meadow. He only knew the land was showing him something. That evening, he removed the saddle from his mare, Juniper, and loosened the reins. He expected her to walk toward the shallow well. She did not. Juniper crossed the yard, past the dry trough, and headed directly toward the lower meadow. Kellen watched her go. Then he followed. Raven Bend had not always looked abandoned. For nearly 30 years, it belonged to Abel Tern, a homesteader who had cut hay, repaired fences, and kept its ditches open with his own hands. Age changed that slowly. A damaged hip made long days harder. Failing eyesight followed. Ditches filled with silt. Fence rails fell. The pump went without repair. After Abel died, his heirs lived too far away to care for 50 difficult acres. Raven Bend sat abandoned for nearly 6 years. Kellen learned the real condition of the place by walking it. The north barn sill was rotten. The loft shifted under weight. Shingles were missing. The garden wall had opened in 2 places, and damp earth had pushed through one corner of the root cellar. At the well, Kellen lowered the bucket until the rope was nearly spent. What came back barely covered the bottom. Later, crossing the lower meadow, he noticed sandstone showing beneath the sod. Several flat stones formed a line too straight to dismiss. He marked the place and moved on. Inside the barn, a rusted horseshoe still hung from one of Abel's pegs. The peg had worked loose. Kellen drove it tight. He left the horseshoe where it was. The first week stripped away whatever confidence 50 acres had given him on paper. Kellen cut rabbit brush until his shoulders burned. He pulled rotten fence posts, gathered rusted wire, and used Juniper to drag cedar logs across the yard. At the barn, he set temporary cottonwood props beneath the weakest corner before removing part of the rotten north sill. Even that was not enough. He worked one timber loose. The wall shifted. A brace snapped sideways. Kellen jumped. A heavy beam dropped behind him and struck the ground hard enough to throw dust across his boots. For several seconds, he stayed where he had landed. Blood ran from a scrape across his palm. Then he studied the wall again. He did not remove another board. Instead, he spent the rest of the afternoon adding props and bracing the entire corner before touching the damaged sill again. Bram passed along the boundary fence near sundown and stopped his horse. "Looks like you're repairing a corpse one piece at a time." Kellen drove another wedge beneath a brace. "One piece is what I can afford." Bram rode on. Kellen sat briefly in the dirt, opened his bleeding hand, then closed it around the hammer again. The next timber stayed exactly where it belonged. By the second week, Raven Bend had become a subject wherever men had time to talk. At Amos Bryce's general store, customers discussed the failing well. At the livery, they wondered how long one man could keep 50 acres fenced. Even outside the Sunday meeting house, Kellen's purchase drew quiet predictions. Bram gave the clearest one. The shallow well would not survive summer. Raven Bend had no dependable water, and no man working alone could rebuild a farm while hauling barrels every day. He'll be hauling water by August and gone by the first hard freeze. The sentence traveled easily. Kellen heard it himself one afternoon while buying square nails from Amos. He said nothing. Amos weighed the nails, checked the store ledger, then counted Kellen's change onto the counter. After the land purchase, seed, food, tools, and the first repair supplies, Kellen had $43.60 left. He counted the coins once. His eyes moved from the money to the box of nails. Then he pushed part of the order back across the counter. Half that many. Amos quietly removed them. Kellen folded the remaining money into his pocket and carried the smaller bundle outside. August was still months away. The money would not last nearly that long if Raven Bend began demanding water by the barrel. The windmill became Kellen's next problem. He climbed the 28-foot wooden tower carefully, testing each brace before trusting his weight to it. Most of the frame was weathered but sound. The machinery was another matter. The vane was gone. One gear tooth had broken away. The crank would not move. Below, the pump rod was bent badly enough to rub against its guide. When Kellen pulled the pump assembly, he found the leather cup dry and hard from years without water. Bram stopped at the fence while Kellen laid the pieces across the yard. "Take the tower down," he said, its firewood standing upright. Kellen studied the iron parts. Then he loaded what he could onto Juniper and rode into town. Ephraim Cole, a 63-year-old blacksmith who repaired wagons, pumps, and farm machinery, examined each piece on his bench. He named a price for putting the assembly right. Kellen reached into his pocket, but did not take out the money. Ephraim noticed. "There's another way." He pointed toward the forge. Kellen could come on weekends. Ephraim would show him how to heat the rod, work the damaged iron, fit new leather, and judge what could still be saved. It would cost less. It would take longer. Kellen looked at the worn pump parts, then at the forge. "When do we start?" Ephraim picked up a hammer. For a moment, Kellen thought the old blacksmith meant to demonstrate. Instead, Ephraim set the hammer on the bench beside him. "Now." For the next several weeks, Raven Bend changed in pieces, small enough that nobody in town noticed. Kellen worked the fence line in the cool mornings. He cleared brush, reset cedar posts, and replaced only the rails that could no longer carry weight. Over at the barn, he managed to cut away the worst section of the rotten sill, successfully fitting solid timber beneath the securely braced wall. By midday, he shifted to smaller work. He reset stones in the garden wall. He patched missing roof shingles. From salvaged sash glass, old boards, and a stone border, he built a low cold frame over a bed warmed with manure beneath the soil. On weekends, he returned to Ephraim's forge. The bent pump rod taught him patience first. Heat too much iron at once, and it could warp somewhere else. So Kellen heated short sections and straightened them gradually. He cut and fitted a new leather cup. He filed the damaged gear tooth. He learned to align the crank without forcing it tight. A working mechanism needed a little play. By late spring, the barn corner no longer shifted when the wind struck it. The pump rod rolled straight across Ephraim's bench. On cold mornings, the soil beneath Kellen's salvaged glass stayed warmer than the ground around it. No crowd came to Raven Bend to see any of it. There was only another post to set, another nail to drive, another piece to repair. Then one Saturday, Kellen began working the iron at the forge. Ephraim watched his first few blows. After that, he turned away and started another job. By early summer, the windmill was ready. Kellen had built a rough new vane from pine boards. The repaired linkage sat back in place. The straightened pump rod reached down the well, ending in the new leather cup he had cut and fitted at Ephraim's forge. On the first morning, there was barely enough wind to stir the grass. The wheel moved half a turn, then stopped. Kellen waited. By afternoon, wind began moving down from the western ridge. The blades turned again, slowly at first, then faster. The crank moved. The pump rod rose and fell. Old iron clicked above the yard. For a long while, nothing reached the trough. Then the pipe coughed. Brown water spilled out. Another stroke brought more. Muddy at first, then lighter, until a thin stream ran steadily into the wooden trough. Across the property line, Bram was repairing fence. He heard the windmill before he saw the water. The old mechanism clattered across the basin, the same tower he had called firewood standing upright. Bram stopped working and stepped away from the fence. Kellen never turned toward him. The trough gained only a few inches before the wind weakened again. The well was still shallow. Its recovery was slow. Nothing about that had changed. But the machine worked. Juniper walked over and drank. Kellen rested one hand against the pump housing. He felt the repaired linkage moving through the iron. He did not smile. Above him, the wheel kept turning. The repaired windmill gave Kellen water, but it did not give Raven Bend more grass. He could not afford a large herd anyway. He began with 9 cattle, 1 milk cow, and Juniper. That was enough to reveal another problem. The animals returned to the same places. They grazed hardest near water and shade. Old trails grew bare beneath their hooves, while grass farther out remained untouched. Mara Bellamy came to Raven Bend after Amos mentioned what Kellen was attempting. A widow who had managed her own small cattle holding for years. She also knew the land records left by her late husband, who had done survey work around the basin. She walked the pasture with Kellen. She showed him grass cropped almost to the soil. Then a compacted trail. Then a shaded corner where cattle had stood so often that little grew beneath them. Kellen had planned to open another section that afternoon. Mara looked across it. What happens if they eat that today? Kellen studied the grass. Then he looked behind them at the ground the cattle had already used. He changed his plan. Using temporary stakes, rope, and movable sections of rail, he began controlling where the animals grazed. He moved them before they stripped one patch bare and left the used ground alone afterward. It meant more walking, more fence work, more watching. Weeks passed. The rested sections began holding taller grass. Raven Bend had not gained a single acre. Kellen was simply learning not to spend the same acre twice. By early summer, the cold frame had yielded results, allowing the garden to produce more than Kellen needed for his own table. Onions came first, followed by beans, cabbage, and turnips. The harvest was modest, but Kellen knew something most farmers around Coldwater Basin had little reason to think about. He knew the freight road. Years as a teamster had taught him where wagons stopped, what animals consumed between runs, and which supplies became difficult to find after days on the trail. A stage stop south of the basin regularly needed fresh vegetables. The nearby freight station bought small amounts of hay for teams passing through. Kellen loaded what Raven Bend could spare and took it south. He did not return with much money. Instead, he traded for things the farm needed more. Salt, lamp oil, seed, another bundle of square nails. When he stopped at Amos Bryce's store afterward, nobody treated the trip as a great success. 9 cattle and a wagon load of vegetables were hardly enough to change anyone's opinion of Raven Bend. Kellen did not need them to. For the first time since buying the property, something had gone out through the gate and returned as supplies instead of another expense. He rode home with a sack of salt behind the saddle, lamp oil wrapped against breakage, and nails tucked into a canvas bag. The farm was not making him rich. It had simply begun paying for some of what it consumed. For Raven Bend, that was enough to matter. By early July, the basin was beginning to show the cost of a dry year. Rain had been scarce. The upper pasture faded from green to yellow, and each week the shallow well recovered more slowly. Even with steady wind, the mill had to work longer to put the same few inches of water into the trough. One morning, Kellen rode Juniper across the lower meadow. Something stopped him. A strip of grass remained green. It was narrow, perhaps 36 feet long, and curved gently through ground that had dried on both sides. Kellen had noticed moisture there before. Now the difference was impossible to miss. Juniper noticed it too. She lowered her head and sniffed along the grass. Kellen dismounted. The old cottonwood stood farther up the draw. The strange sandstone line he had found weeks earlier turned out to cross this exact same stretch of ground. He returned with a shovel. Right at the green strip, his first cut sliced through a thick mat of roots. Beneath it, the blade struck stone. Kellen cleared the soil with his hands. Sandstone. He moved several feet down the green strip and dug again. Another flat slab, then another. They followed the same gentle curve. Kellen knelt and worked his fingers beneath the edge of the first stone. It was heavier than it looked. He loosened the soil, lifted carefully, and rolled the slab aside. The surrounding ground was dry and warm. The underside of the stone was cold, and beneath it, the earth was still damp. Kellen made the mistake because the first sign looked promising. Water was there. He could see moisture gathering beneath the sandstone, and the simplest answer seemed obvious. If a narrow opening exposed a little water, a wider and deeper trench should expose more. So he kept digging. He removed another slab, then another. The opening widened. His shovel cut below the root layer and into the wet ground beneath it. At first, the result seemed to prove him right. Muddy water began seeping into the trench. Kellen worked faster. Then one side softened. A section of bank slumped inward. Silt rolled across the bottom. The water turned brown. Kellen cleared it with the shovel, but more loose soil followed. Within hours, the flow weakened. By late afternoon, the trench he had opened was wider, deeper, and producing less clear water than when he started. Bram happened along the boundary and saw the excavation. He dismounted and walked close enough to study the mud without stepping into it. This time, there was no laughter. You may have found water and killed it in the same afternoon. Kellen looked down at the trench. He had no answer worth giving. Bram rode away. Near dusk, Kellen stopped trying to clear the silt. Every pass of the shovel disturbed something else. He washed his hands in a bucket, but dark mud remained beneath his nails and across his knuckles. Then he sat at the edge of the excavation. Hours earlier, water had gathered beneath the first stone. Now only a few cloudy drops worked their way through the mud. For once, Raven Bend had not failed him. He had failed Raven Bend. Kellen did not touch the trench the next morning. Instead, he rode to Mara Bellamy's place and described the sandstone line, the wet soil beneath it, and what happened after he opened the ground. Mara listened before asking where the stones ran. When Kellen showed her, she remembered something. Her late husband had kept old survey papers from his work around Coldwater Basin. Among them was a field notebook and a county plat nearly 20 years old. They spread both across her kitchen table. Near Raven Bend, faded pencil marked a shallow drainage as wet draw. Farther down was a small spring symbol. A thin line followed the slope toward the lower meadow. Beside it was a name. Jory Bell. Kellen took the papers to Ephraim. The blacksmith remembered Bell. He had been a traveling ditch builder and stone worker who took small jobs wherever ranchers needed water moved across difficult ground. Nothing more remarkable than that. But the old marks changed what Kellen understood. Mara studied the line again. You may not have found a well. What lay beneath the meadow could have been a collection gallery. A shallow seep had been left mostly undisturbed, then surrounded with gravel and bundles of willow to let water pass while holding back soil. Flat stone protected the top. From there, gravity could carry the gathered water downhill. The system did not depend on a deep hole. It depended on keeping the wet layer intact. That explained the green strip. It explained the sandstone. It also explained why Kellen's trench had weakened as he enlarged it. He had thought he was clearing away useless earth. Instead, a man dead for years had placed those stones according to a system Kellen had nearly destroyed in one afternoon. When Kellen returned to the lower meadow, he brought the shovel. This time, he used it to put earth back. He began with the section he had opened too wide. Loose soil came out first. Then he rebuilt the sides with firm earth packed with clay, restoring support around the wet seam instead of exposing more of it. Near the seep, he worked slowly. He placed coarse gravel where water could move through open spaces. Over that went thin bundles of willow, laid tightly enough to catch silt without sealing the flow. Then he began replacing the sandstone. The work felt backward after years of solving problems with more digging, more leverage, or more force. Here, every unnecessary cut could make the problem worse. Kellen left only a small collection pocket open at the lower end. From there, he followed the old grade down the meadow instead of trying to pull water straight upward. Mara came by before evening. For several hours, there was little to see. Moisture darkened the gravel. Then drops gathered. The drops became a narrow trickle. This time, the water carried less mud. Mara crouched beside the collection pocket. "The stones aren't making water," she said. "They're keeping what's already here from disappearing into the mud." Kellen watched the clear thread collect below them. He had spent weeks learning how to make iron move again. The meadow required a different lesson. Sometimes the right repair meant disturbing less. Before leaving, Kellen fitted the final sandstone slab back over the seep. His muddy hand rested on its surface for a moment. Then he covered the stone with earth. The water continued moving underneath. Once the seep was gathering clean water again, Kellen followed the old grade farther downhill. He found the remains of the buried line a few inches below the surface. Some cedar sections had rotted until they collapsed under his fingers. Others had survived well enough in the damp soil to show how they had once been fitted. The original work was too damaged to copy piece for piece. Kellen stopped trying. What mattered was the principle. Gather the water above. Let sediment settle. Carry the cleaner water downhill. Keep the line covered from heat, hooves, and debris. Near the collection gallery, he shaped a shallow settling pocket. Farther down, he fitted new cedar trough sections where the ground allowed it. Where timber would not sit properly, he built narrow channels from flat stone. At the joints, cloth coated with warm pine pitch helped close the gaps. He checked the fall carefully before covering each section with earth. The line finally reached a stock tank in the lower pasture. At first, nothing happened. Kellen walked back uphill, checking every connection. Then he heard it. Water. A thin stream slipped from the outlet and struck the bottom of the tank. It was not much, but it kept coming. Above the farm, the windmill wheel stood completely still in the quiet afternoon. No crank moved, no pump rod worked, yet the tank was filling. The cattle began gathering nearby. Kellen stayed beside the outlet and listened. For the first time since he had come to Raven Bend, water was moving across the farm without wind, a bucket, or his own strength. For several days, the buried line worked well enough that Kellen began to trust it. Then the stream weakened. By the following morning, it had become little more than a drip. This time, Kellen did not start digging blindly. He went uphill first. The settling pocket held more silt than he expected. Fine roots and bits of debris had gathered near the inlet. Farther down, one cedar joint was drawing air where the pine pitch had pulled away. 3 small faults had nearly stopped the whole line. Kellen cleaned the pocket without cutting into the wet seam below it. He deepened only the settling space, giving mud somewhere to collect before it entered the conduit. At the inlet, he added a crude screen woven from thin willow. Then he followed the line downhill. One section did not have enough fall. He raised its upper end on flat stones and checked the grade again. At the leaking joint, he removed the failed seal, wrapped fresh cloth around the connection, and worked warm pine pitch into it. Before covering everything, he changed one more thing. Instead of burying the settling pocket permanently, Kellen fitted a broad sandstone slab over it. The stone could be lifted whenever the system needed cleaning. By evening, water reached the tank again. The stream was steadier than before. Kellen washed the silt from his hands and replaced the access stone. He had once believed finding the buried system might solve Raven Bend's water problem. Now he understood something harder. Old knowledge did not remove maintenance. It only showed where the work mattered. And when the line failed this time, Kellen had known where to look. August came with the heat Bram had warned about. Day after day, hot wind crossed Coldwater Basin and pulled moisture from everything it touched. Shallow ponds shrank into muddy depressions. Grass along the upper bench cured early, turning pale beneath a hard sky. Kellen's windmill still turned. The problem was below it. The well recovered more slowly after each pumping. The buried gallery continued feeding the lower tank, but its steady stream had narrowed. Across the boundary, Bram began hauling water by barrel to part of his herd. At Amos's store, nobody laughed about Raven Bend anymore. Too many men were measuring their own wells. Kellen measured something else. Hay. If the remaining pasture failed, what he had stored would carry his cattle about 6 weeks. Then Lottie Fenner, a 41-year-old widow who kept a small holding lower in the basin, arrived with her 10-year-old son, Noah, and 2 empty barrels in the wagon. Her well had fallen too low to provide enough water for their milk cow. Kellen looked at the barrels, then at his stock tank. The spring line was still feeding it, but slowly. He opened the valve. Water filled the first barrel. Noah stood beside their cow, one hand holding the lead rope while the animal watched the water. When the first barrel was full, Kellen checked the tank again. Its level had dropped several inches. He waited. The buried line continued its thin flow. Then Kellen moved the second barrel into place. He opened the valve again. The wind changed after dark. It came hard across the dry basin, carrying dust through fence rails, beneath doors, and over the lower meadow. It blew for hours. By morning, Kellen knew something was wrong. The stock tank had barely risen. He checked the outlet. Drip. Nothing. Another drip. The cattle were already gathering. Kellen moved fast. He climbed to the collection gallery and lifted the sandstone access cover. Fine dust and silt had packed into the settling pocket. He cleared it by hand, cleaned the willow screen, and waited. The outlet did not recover. He checked the inlet. Clear. The joint below it. Sound. He followed the buried line downhill, opening only the places he needed. Still nothing. Then he found it. A section of soil had settled during the dry spell. The conduit had dropped with it. The grade that once carried water steadily downhill now sagged before rising again. Water had collected inside. Air was trapped beyond it. The line could no longer pull properly. Kellen looked toward the herd. One steer pushed its muzzle into the trough and struck a horn against the dry wood. The sound stopped him for half a second. He had heard animals search for water before, on cavalry trails where a bad calculation could cost more than a day's travel. Then he moved again. If he opened the entire buried line, the repair could take hours, maybe longer. The August sun was already climbing. For the first time since spring, Bram's prediction no longer sounded like mockery. Raven Bend was running out of water. Kellen did not uncover the whole line. He had made that kind of mistake once. Instead, he followed the grade carefully, sighting along a straight board and measuring the fall between exposed sections. The problem narrowed to a short stretch where the ground had settled. He opened only that section. Flat stones went beneath the sagging conduit. He raised it little by little until the downhill fall returned. Mud and trapped sediment came out next. Then he reset the joint and packed the soil firmly around it. A wagon approached from the north. Bram arrived with empty water barrels. He saw the cattle pressing toward the trough and understood the problem without asking. He did not offer advice. He simply opened the gate, moved the herd away from the excavation, and kept them there while Kellen worked. At the collection pocket, Kellen added a low stone lip against wind-blown dust, then strengthened the willow screen with brush. He returned to the outlet. Nothing. Then a drop fell. Another followed. A thin thread appeared. It strengthened into a narrow, steady stream. Water struck the bottom of the trough. Kellen waited. The stream held. An hour later, it was still running. By afternoon, the cattle had drunk, and the tank was slowly gaining again. The heat did not break. The drought did not end. That was what made the answer matter. The system worked, while the basin was still trying to empty it. Bram released the last steer and walked to the outlet. He crouched beside the flowing water and held 2 fingers beneath it. Then he looked toward the buried sandstone line. How far below that first stone did you find the wet seam? Months earlier, Bram had watched Kellen from across a fence. Now he was kneeling beside him, asking how the water worked. By the fall of 1884, Raven Bend was still no rich man's property. It had simply become a working farm. The barn stood straighter. The gardens supplied Kellen's table, and enough produce for barter. His cattle had survived the dry summer. When the wind came across the ridge, the repaired wheel still turned above the yard, and beneath the lower meadow, water kept moving. At Amos Bryce's store one afternoon, someone remembered the prediction made the year before. Bram could have explained that the drought had been worse than expected, or that no one had known about the buried waterworks. He did neither. I was wrong about the place. That was all. Before winter, Bram brought an old survey plat of his own ranch to Raven Bend. Lottie asked Kellen what signs might reveal a wet seam on her land. At the forge, Ephraim began seeing farmers arrive with pump parts they once would have thrown away. Mara watched old maps become useful again. Jory Bell had been dead for years, yet part of what he understood was moving through Coldwater Basin once more. Kellen never became a teacher. There was too much work left for that. One cold morning, he crossed the lower meadow beneath a white layer of frost. Almost everything was frozen pale. One narrow strip remained dark where moisture moved beneath the soil. Kellen stopped near the first sandstone slab he had uncovered. It was buried again. A stranger crossing Raven Bend would never know it was there. Farther down the meadow, water fell steadily into the stock trough. Beyond it, the old windmill turned in the morning wind.